Well, hello again to everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Charles Nathan, your friendly guide helping you to navigate the shadowy swamp that is the modern British state. Today, we're taking a quick look at a recent meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. They were hearing the last session of oral evidence surrounding the renewal of the BBC's charter, which expires at the end of next year, 2027. The committee itself is a fairly standard setup of 11 members with a Labour majority, so no surprises there. Perhaps a little unusual is that there is a Conservative chair, so that's something a little bit different. Not that it makes a huge difference when we're talking about the BBC. Giving evidence were the Right Honourable Lisa Nandy, who's the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. Also, Robert Specterman Green. He's obviously given us his superhero name and not his daytime name, but he's the Director of Media and International at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. This was a fairly routine and largely unremarkable hearing. There were no dramatic fireworks, but don't be fooled into thinking that we can't learn anything from it. In fact, if you know how to listen, it taught us quite a lot about how the establishment thinks and how it views itself. It's been very instructive, and we're going to go through some of that now. One of the subjects that always comes up at these kind of meetings is the fact that, despite having invested heavily in places like Manchester and Cardiff, the BBC is still very London-centric. There were discussions, of course, about the outgoing Director-General and the incoming Director-General and how they're very keen to improve the footprint and representation in the nations and the regions, and that's all well and good. But that's work that's been going on for a very long time now, so surely we should be seeing some more positive results, and we should be able to see that output on our screens. Well, here's an interesting anecdote that was brought up in the meeting.
My counterpart in the Scottish Government, Angus Robertson, raised with me a little while ago the instance of traitors, where people were bussed in to Scotland from London in order to make distinctly Scottish content and then bussed back out again. Now, I guess the message to broadcasters from those of us who don't live in London and the South East is that we can see you, and we can see when this is not distinctly Scottish or Northern or Eastern region content.
Anyone in media who lives outside London will tell you it was ever thus. So despite all these massive investments of taxpayer money in places like Salford and Cardiff, it's somehow still impossible to find people outside of London to do this work. It's kind of interesting, so the more things change, the more they stay the same. It does actually beg the question, what are these places outside London actually doing, because they're clearly not making programmes like Traitors. But anyway, let's move on. As we're talking about the BBC, it didn't take long for the other inevitable question regarding editorial impartiality and political bias to come up. It always does, and it always will. The responses were fairly predictable. You can look at the link down below if you want to see what the Secretary of State actually had to say about that. But it was the usual kind of thing you'd expect. Things are being done, we're making strides, and we're improving, and so on and so forth. And still these problems keep arising. But I think what was really interesting was the preamble to a question that Dr. Rupa Huck asked, and it was absolutely priceless. I'm just going to let you have a listen to what she said.
But when you have a prolonged period in government of people on the right, then they can stack it. So that's why your words are so welcome to depoliticise.
It either takes a galactic-sized blind spot or some weapons-grade brass neck to sit there on camera and claim that the political left would never dream of politicising the BBC. Bearing in mind that the political left are the people who spend all day, every waking moment politicising everything that their gaze falls upon. So to say that thank goodness the Tories have gone and now we can get back to an impartial BBC is one of the most amazing things I've ever heard from a politician. I honestly couldn't tell you whether the good doctor had any idea of how ridiculous she sounded when she said that. But the Secretary of State was not to be outdone. And here's a second brilliant example of brass neck and galactic-sized blind spots.
So the question becomes, how does the BBC protect its ability to counter that mis and disinformation? How does it do that in an era where You've got huge consolidation, major players who are operating at scale, not just in the broadcasting landscape, but also online as well. I was reading with interest the exchange that you had with Matt Britton about X, the X platform, whether the BBC should be on that. I have to say I absolutely strongly support the idea that the BBC should be on X, because I think that the BBC is the alternative trusted source that you can go to on that site. The reason I think it's different when it comes to government departments and the decision that I made to take my department off X is because I think politicians aren't neutral. We shouldn't be neutral. We have a stance. We exist to advance a viewpoint. And by being on sites where the algorithms are loaded in order to divide us from one another, and to where information is being pumped out that is false and misleading, I think that politicians have a responsibility to consider our own role in whether we should help to support and attract people to those sites or not. And my view that I came to was not. But I think the BBC has to be in all of these spaces and has to be able to counter that.
So here we have the astonishing spectacle of the Secretary of State trying to portray the BBC as some kind of small, heroic Davidian figure, standing alone for the cause of truth, light and impartiality against the dark Goliaths of the internet, the streaming giants and YouTube. Again, it really takes either a galactic-sized blind spot or some real brass neck to try and pull that off. You can say what you like about Amazon and Netflix and all the others, but they won't come knocking on your door with bailiffs and court orders if you decide you don't want to use their services. The same could not be said of the BBC. As is usual in government, what we see here is a complete inversion of the truth. The truth is, the BBC is just as much a media juggernaut as Amazon or Netflix or YouTube or any of the others. And not only that, it's funded entirely, as we know, by an extremely regressive form of taxation, not free exchange. You don't have to buy Amazon or Netflix. You try getting by with a television and not having a TV licence, even if you never go anywhere near any BBC products. Good luck with that. To try to claim some kind of media moral high ground while bringing the full coercive power of the state to bear on people who don't pay this extremely regressive tax is frankly morally abhorrent. This is a classic example of how the Westminster bubble views itself as virtuous while the rest of the country thinks exactly the opposite. There's virtually nobody outside the Westminster bubble who thinks that the BBC is any kind of arbiter of truth or impartiality, fighting against disinformation, against shadowy and usually poorly defined threats to our democracy. Nobody's buying that shtick anymore, so please give us a break and stop patronising us. We're all tired of it, and we can all see exactly what you're doing. In the end, the BBC is just part of the establishment, and it stands to further the cause of the same beige managerial Blairism we've all been having to deal with for the last 30 years. We're done with it, we don't want it, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. Yeah, the licence fee might survive a few more years, but the days of the BBC as we know it are numbered. It's inevitable. In the end, the BBC is simply a reflection of the establishment it serves while claiming not to. Both the establishment and the BBC are behemoths that are chasing smaller and smaller audiences as people get wise to them and look for alternatives. The political establishment is on its way out, and the BBC will follow it in due course. And just like the political establishment, I've no doubt the BBC will live on in some form in the future, but it'll be nothing like it was, and it will have nothing like the influence it used to have, and very, very few of us will be sorry about that. That's it for today. I hope you found that informative, and I hope it gave you a little glimpse as to how the establishment views itself. As always, please like, share, subscribe, comment, do all that cool stuff. It helps to grow the channel, and it helps to keep these important messages getting out there, because always remember, our ignorance is their power. Take care, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye for now.